morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Sister Katie. I'm very happy that you all have come back for day 2 of this wonderful conference. As we begin today, I first of all want to thank you for returning. And also, as far as the drill for today, it's going to be pretty much as it was yesterday. Our speakers will each speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and we will have time then for a small group discussion. And then at the end, we'll also have time for questions from the floor, okay? So without further ado, because they're way more interesting than I am, one quick disclaimer. If I totally mutilate somebody's name, it's not intentional, it's genetic. So our first speaker this morning is going to be Jorge Costadoat. Okay, Jorge is a Jesuit priest from Chile, and he is an associate researcher and professor of theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, specializing in Trinity, Christology, and Latin American theology. Kind of covers almost everything you could think of, right? He's also served the university as director of its theology program and director of the Manuel Lorraine Theological Center. In addition, he also leads a base ecclesial community in the greater Santiago area and lectures at various theological centers throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. His past positions include things like serving on the board of the Theological Commission of the Jesuits in Latin America, and he holds a PhD in theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. So other than that, he's just been a slacker sitting around doing nothing. So, Jorge, come forward.
I thanks a lot for this invitation. I thanks especially to Karen Kraft. She made the translation of this text. Anyway, I beg your pardon because my English is very poor. For this reason, I have to read the text.
I have to advance the slides because we lost the.
Oh,
you tell me when you want to advance the slide.
In any case, you can have initiatives. Say, I forgot maybe. Huh? The title of this conference is The Theological Nature of the Poor. No, it's not that. It's the poor as theologians, right? The preferential option for the poor has been criticized by some conservative groups that have been seen in it an ideological resource of the left. It is possible it has been that we can rule out its misapplications, but it also has enduring gospel roots. The option for the poor is novel in terms of its magisterial formulation, but it's nothing new to the history of Christianity. Opting for the poor is, you could say, an essential characteristic of the Christian faith. The option for the poor ultimately is God's way of being. God will to make himself known through his Son, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. The incarnation expresses God's will to be identified with the poor. But we must remember, his will is not to keep them in poverty, but to lift them out of it. We the Poor Against Poverty has become commonplace among Latin American theologians. Okay. First, we love you with a preferential affection. In this regard, the impact of Paul VI address to the farm workers of Mosquera, Colombia, 1968, must be mentioned. At the opening of the General Conference of Bishops in Medellin, the first time a pope set foot on the continent, he recalled the importance to God and to the Church of love to the poor. Pope Montini anticipated what could be perhaps the most characteristic formulation of Latin Americans' reception of the Council. He said to the farm workers, "We love you with a preferential affection, and along with us always remember this and hold it close. The Holy Catholic Church loves you." We have come to Bogota to honor Jesus in his Eucharistic mystery, and are full of joy to have had the opportunity to do this, also coming here now to celebrate before the Church and the world the Lord's presence among us in all of you. You are a sign, an image, a mystery of Christ's presence. The sacrament of the Eucharist offers us his hidden presence, alive and real. You are also a sacrament, a sacred image of the Lord in the world, a reflection that represents and doesn't hide his face, both human and divine. It should come as no surprise this need to recognize Christ himself in the poor. The evangelist Matthew did so in one of the parables most quoted by the Magisterium and Liberation Theology, Matthew 25. The Puebla Conference formulated at the magisterial level the need for preferential option for the poor. In regard to this, and to the words of Paul VI, the Third Solemn Conference asked us to see Christ in the faces of the poor of all kinds. Years later, the Santo Domingo Conference brought the list of the faces of the poor. Aparecida, the next conference, expanded without limit the list of faces of the poor, in which it wanted the Church to see Christ's face. In addition, the Fifth Conference final document has drawn attention to the fact that the Church considers the option for the poor essential to the Christian life. Aparecida makes its own words of Benedict XVI on his inauguration. The Pope inextricably links Christ and the poor. The preferential option for the poor is implicit in the Christological faith in God, who became poor for us. In short, whoever does not opt for the poor cannot consider themselves Christian. Second, the poor are a theological place. Another way of expressing this presence of Christ in the poor is that of Latin American theology. Theologians often speak of the poor or their history as a theological place. The poor are not only sacraments of Christ, but it must be considered that in some way they reveal God to us. This term is noteworthy because in the renowned theologian Melchior Cano's categorization, history, historical events, or the very poor themselves should be considered sources from outside of theology, not proper to theology as such. In this sense, for example, it could be said that the scriptures are understood through the poor. They are a hermeneutical place, even a privileged one, for understanding the sources of revelation. However, the most noble thing is to think that in the poor, through their mouths, God speaks and says something new. In this sense, Latin Americans carry out a semantic mutation. Ignacio Yacuria contends, the poor in Latin America are a theological place inasmuch as they constitute the most extreme and scandalous prophetic and apocalyptic presence of the Christian God, and consequently the privileged location for praxis and Christian reflection. The Salvadorian martyr of the Church maintains that when doing theology, it must be recognized that the poor are a source of knowledge of God and not only a hermeneutical place. In contrast, in one of the most interesting theological disputes of Latin American theology, Clodovis, not Leonardo, vigorously rejects this possibility. The Brazilian Servite comes to question the very foundation of liberation theology. The theology of liberation arrives inadvertently at this perversion. God became poor, therefore the poor are God. An aberrant calculation by which the free and loving relationship between God and the poor is ontologized and ends up becoming petrified in a miserable metaphysics. Perpetuating poverty itself in this way, it achieves the extreme ideologization of the poor. The Brazilian theologians continues, but even today, liberation theologians repeat loudly that God is revealed in the poor and that the poor are the privileged place for knowing and encountering God. With that language, which has no doctrinal but rather spiritual value, liberation theology runs the risk of overlooking the fact that the poor, through antonomasia, are the Word incarnate, the privileged place for knowing God. It can be said, theologically speaking, that He alone is, as the Word incarnate, the scientific principle in the sense that He makes known. In other words, both differs from other liberation theologians on a critical issue. Both does not accept that the poor are the source of knowledge of God. For him, they are simply a hermeneutical place from which it is possible to comprehend the world. Third, the poor as theologians. This is the main point. Assuming this, we can say that the poor must be theologians, that is, the first Christian thinkers of their own liberation. The topic hasn't been sufficiently developed, but all the necessary elements are there to arrive at this conclusion. First, we must consider that in this theology, the theologian's involvement in the method is essential and not accidental. The personal shared spiritual experience of the professional theologians with the others with whom they share their cause is indispensable. Latin American theologians participate in the practice of liberating the oppressed and don't see their taking side as impairing the scientific nature of their work. On the contrary,
I'll let you.
On the contrary, this commitment, this partiality, is the fundamental epistemological condition. In this respect, however, two modes and two stages of liberation theology can be distinguished. In a first variation of this theology, the Gramscian's idea of believing that intellectuals should lead the poor to liberation predominated. Among Latin Americans, a generation of theologians arose that wanted to educate the poor in the understanding and a practical application of the word in a unilateral way. José Francisco Gómez Hinojosa has found the middle way by adopting Gramsci's contribution of a conception of a type of organic theologian, while at the same time opposing his intellectualism. For Gramsci, the Gregorian doctoral student points out, the intellectual teach the masses without any need to learn from them. Gómez Hinojosa, on the other hand, demands that theologians open themselves to the poor's modes of knowing. If the poor, as Puebla says, evangelize the church, they must be capable of having fundamental theological knowledge. Theologians and the poor know, but in different ways. The people at the grassroots know what they live and don't worry about the complication of living what is scientifically known. It's by working together that a new intellectual and a new base emerge. Among Latin Americans, Pedro Trigo, ahí está. Pedro Trigo, theologians, according to Pedro, theologians could have to be initiated into the world of the poor to be able to overcome the enlightened relationship. They will likely always be an intellectual person. Those who know themselves and possess themselves, those are the ones that liberate themselves through the sovereign use of their reason and faculties that have within themselves the principle and foundation, the self-governing. It's essential that they find themselves with the impassable limit, something like having the experience of evil within oneself, due to the conviction of the impossibility of reaching salvation through one's own powers by opening up to what is going to give value to the subject. Trigo goes further than Gómez Hinojosa. Professional theologians must enter into the culture and Catholicism of the common people and convert themselves to the Christianity of the poor. In fact, in the base ecclesial communities, the poor have acted as theologians. The icon for the popular method of reading the Bible that is practiced in these communities is a circle with a woman with the scriptures in her hands, reading and unraveling its meaning with other people. Although an expert in the sacred scriptures, Carlos Mester situates himself in an auxiliary role when the Bible is read in these communities. He knows that the interpretation of the word belongs to the communities and not to the exegetors, for they are at the service of what God wants to tell the people who are members. The objective of the interpretation is no longer to interpret the Bible, but to interpret the life with the help of the Bible. According to the Brazilian Carmelite, with the help of the Bible, the people discover where and how God speaks to us today through events. Gathering up loose ends, it is possible to go further, even further. It must not be only the poor who are recognized as theologians. If Christians, and the poor in particular, were not theologians, neither could they be Christian. It is important to keep in mind that Vatican I, 1870, condemned fideism. The Christians live their life by the light of faith, must not be seen as a concession the magisterium or the theologians make to the poor. Instead, it is the right and obligation. The approach of biblical scholars like Masters make it necessary to invert the conception of theology. It is first an activity of Christians, and second, a professional activity that supports an essential theological task. Conclusion. This is my community at Santiago, Chile. The table of the house is the same place for the Eucharist. Conclusion. Liberation theology shares with the 20th century theology the need to verify eschatological salvation as intra-historical liberation. During the 60s and years following in Latin America and the Caribbean, this emerging theology supported political effort to lift people out of the poverty caused by injustices that were not only personal but also structural. At the same time, liberation theologians supported agricultural reform, baked leftist politicians encouraged the fight against human rights violation, one of them, and in recent decades resisted neoliberalism. Also during those years, basic access to culture was enormously important in establishing the poor as subject of their own socio-political liberation. Literacy was key. The poor could be lifted out of destitution not only by intellectuals and government. They themselves could more clearly see the avenues of this possibility. Becoming protagonists of history, the poor were in a position to overcome the alienation of oppression. When they have reflected on the life in the light of the faith of the Church, they have acted as theologians. Thanks.
Jorge, thank you very much. I think we've all known for years that we could learn a lot from the poor, but as theologians, I think that's a new concept for some of us. So thank you. I appreciate that. Very good. Next, we're going to hear from Sister Theresa Ike, one of our daughters of charity and a friend. She will not let us say very much about her, so it's going to be brief. Sister Theresa is originally from the Nigerian province and has been a daughter for 37 years, according to our breakfast conversation, and currently lives at the Mother House in Paris, where she represents the daughters on the continent of Africa. Sister has been a formator for a large part of her community life and continues to form in a different way as a general counselor. So Sister Theresa is going to speak to us of the mission of the daughters in Africa. Thank you.
Well,
morning, everyone. Thank you, Katie. Introduction. First, I would want to thank the organizers of the conference. Very well organized, and your topic or the theme for this year is very attractive, very catchy, and the content is very good. And I feel privileged to be part of it. So thank you very much. And thank you too to Betty Ann for making me feel comfortable in the United States. It's my first time here. We're talking about marginality, the evolution of the concept of the church. And when that topic was sent to me to participate, it was inspiration. I wouldn't say I just manufactured the topic. I was inspired to talk about the evolution of the mission of the Daughters of Charity in Sub-Saharan Africa. You know, Africa is big, it's very large. There is a part of Africa that is not very African. You all know that. So I'm concentrating on the Sub-Saharan part. And the word beyond charity, you know, as charity is the greatest of values or virtues, as we know, but in the sense I am using it means going beyond kindness, for instance, going beyond being generous, to actually empowering people to become, helping people to evolve and be whom God has made them to be, or had wanted them to be. So, the Daughters of Charity, as most of us here know, everybody actually would know, were founded by St. Vincent de Paul and St. Theresa in France in the 17th century. Basically to care for the corporal and spiritual needs of those who live in poverty. That was 1633. And it was in France, but gradually, during the life of St. Vincent, St. Louis, the daughters moved from France to Poland. But to Africa, they came in the 19th century. The first place was Madagascar in 1897. And from there, the French Daughters of Charity went to Eritrea, but they didn't stay for too long because of the oppressive government at that time. We still have it in Eritrea today. The Daughters of Charity actually were dismissed from that place. They had to leave. But later in the early 20th century, actually precisely 75 years ago, this year, the Italian Daughters of Charity returned to Eritrea. And the Belgic daughters, the Irish daughters, the British daughters started going to different places. Today, we have Daughters of Charity in 20 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the good thing about it is that there is a mixture of missionaries, so that in the places you don't have perhaps the domination of a particular group, maybe French or English. You have Americans, you have those from South America, you have those people from Europe, and even Africans have become missionaries to themselves as I speak. When I was asked to contribute to this particular topic, I was very excited. First, because I'm a daughter of charity. And when you talk about marginality, we are talking about the actually vocation of the Daughters of Charity. When you talk about people who are kept aside, you are inviting the Daughter of Charity to action. So that actually attracted me. And secondly, because I have that innate desire to include people. Inclusion is a passion for me. And we know that inclusion is the undoing of marginality. From the e-book Marginality by Gatsweller and Braun, I found a definition. Marginality to be an involuntary position and condition of an individual or a group of people at the margins of all societal systems, be it economic, social, education, everything that is within the society. They find themselves at the margin, and that prevents them from access to resources, assets, and services, restraining freedom of choice, preventing the development of capacities, and eventually causing extreme poverty. So extreme poverty, as we have it in Africa, is not, yesterday Ray said, Frederick Ozanam said, the poor are not responsible for their poverty. Actually, the system creates poor people. No one chooses to be at the margin, and that's what we just said. But as a result of a faulty system, many have been condemned to remain at the margin of the society they call their own. And you know, it's very, very uncomfortable and dangerous too to be at the margin of anything at all. When you are at the edge, the chances are that you can fall off the cliff. No matter what aspect of marginality one considers to explain extreme poverty, millions of people all over the world live in this condition. But particularly according to statistics, international statistical data, majority of them live in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. We have the harsh reality of poverty in Sub-Saharan Africa. I took the pictures of when the sisters first arrived, when the daughters first arrived. At the arrival of the Daughters of Charity in Africa in the late 19th and early 20th century, the sisters were greeted by what I have called naked poverty. You know, that kind of poverty that has neither shame nor dignity. Children, adolescent, adults, they are naked like Adam and Eve, you know, in the original story of creation, but they're not ashamed. So the missionaries from the civilized world, they appear and they see these children who are naked, and then with mucus, you know, kata, dried for about 4 days because they haven't taken their bath. And then the missionaries come. What do the children do? What did they smile? They're very happy. They're very happy with themselves. But you see, some of them are not able to, and because they are hungry. This gave the missionaries a rich shock. So, as I said, their mission evolved. What was the first thing they did? You have the first phase of the mission of the Daughters of Charity in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is addressing the question of poverty through handouts. Naturally, if you meet somebody who is hungry, what do? You give food, because St. Vincent would say you get to a man's heart through his stomach. So the daughters engaged in giving food, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, healing the sick, visiting those who were not able to come out, and providing their needs. With many heartrending stories of hunger, sickness, and death, and other forms of deprivation, the Daughters of Charity would generously hand out things, both in cash and in kind. And rather than actually minimizing poverty, it increased. Why? Because those who received today called out those who didn't come today for tomorrow. So tomorrow, rather than 20 people, you have 40. And then the day after that, you have 60. Those who came yesterday will still come tomorrow and the day after. So it kind of had a negative multiplying effect. And the impression was, why work if you can get all that you need for free? So the people were coming and getting what they needed. And the daughters were not tired. But as they started accepting indigenous sisters, the sisters also who knew what the people knew and what trick can be played, started asking questions and telling the missionaries, you don't just hand out things like that. Let these people work. Let them do something. So we get to the phase 2 of small jobs and small wages. Now, Vincent de Paul said to his daughters, you will see that charity is a heavy burden to carry, heavier than a pot of soup. But you must keep your kindness and your smile. By this, St. Vincent meant that soup and bread are not enough. One must get more involved in the lives of those who suffer, and with compassion, share in their pains and suffering. Some poor persons who were strong enough to work, they were given jobs, like security people or gardeners, and with that, they still received some food, but the sisters paid them. You do your work, you get something. So with money in their pockets, there was some kind of dignity, the dignity of labor. They started raising their heads. But don't ask me what they did with the money, no. But some used it well, others didn't. Sorry, what did I do? We know, as I was saying, there is the other side of this good thing that the daughters were doing. But, the sisters were doing very well. But on the other side, when you look at it, they thought for the people. They imagined what the people would need. They offered assistance. And we remember when we're talking about marginality, we are not just talking about the absence of food and maybe social needs. We are also talking about the development of the mind of the people, involvement of the people. So this was lacking in the initial mission of the Daughters of Charity because they were the servants of the poor. So they did everything, including thinking for the poor. So somehow inadvertently, they contributed to the marginalization which they didn't mean to, because the people's personal capabilities were not developed, because the sisters actually assumed the people's voices. They became the voice of the voiceless. But like the society, the Daughters of Charity also evolved, like their mission. They learned not just from experience, but from others as well. So we go, in the phase 3, we start moving towards self-development and systemic change. Here, the daughters started asking questions. People are hungry. You don't just give them food. Yesterday, when we were going through the presentations of the students, the one who researched on Don't Held the Camera had said that don't go say, if I give people food, people praise me as being charitable and kind. When I ask the question, why are these people hungry? They call me a communist. So I think that happened to the daughters too. At a point, they just didn't feed them. If people are hungry, they will give food, but the approach of the daughters in ministry or in mission, or the different approaches were not mutually exclusive. They will still give food to whoever is hungry, but they will ask question, why is this person hungry? Sometimes that put them at loggerheads with the government, especially where you have a repressive kind of government. It's very famous in Africa too. So the sisters again started developing people's capacities. They engaged in formal education. At this time, schools were established. They established skill acquisition centers. And the education of the girl child was very much emphasized. Because in Africa then, a girl is as important as the father is, or the husband. So you are a human being if you have a man's name attached to you. the time the sisters were there. So, but to have a girl being educated was not very usual. It could be for you, but then it wasn't for us. Apart from abject poverty and gender issues, some illnesses and disabilities were also causes of discrimination and marginalization of people. Have something like leprosy and disabilities of every kind. This, actually, a leper, even today, when you could say somebody is a leper, it means that you're an outcast. But what did the daughters do? When they came, these people who nobody cared about, the sisters approached them, but in their unique way. So to demarginalize people, there was the creation of physical infrastructure and institutional arrangements. The sisters built special schools, created rehabilitation centers, and they lived with the people. They lived with their children with disabilities. The ones you see down there, they are hearing impaired. Some of them are visually impaired. But they are now, the sisters started growing. When I talk about inclusion and demarginalization, it is about creating a situation where everybody feels welcome. Because with special schools, the children and the adolescents, even the adults, they feel very comfortable where they are. They feel very comfortable, but we cannot create a special market for them. You cannot create a special church. You cannot create a special society. So that was the disadvantage of special schools and all those rehabilitation centers that were mainly for these persons who are marginalized. So the sisters then started training the people into self-advocacy. We have accepted you. How can the society accept these people who have been marginalized? With that, we get into inclusive education, economic empowerment, like we have in the Seeds of Hope. The sisters discovered that economic empowerment can systemically address the problem of hunger, illness, and illiteracy at the same time. So they embrace this approach and try to transform a complete series of interacting elements rather than just one. You are not just addressing hunger, you are addressing many things at the same time. So you create a chain of interacting elements. They also created women cooperative groups. As I said, women had very little voice. So to empower the women and make them valued in community, they created groups. Because sometimes when you establish one person and there is an illness or challenge in the family, the profit is gone, the capital is also gone. So what did the sisters do? They adopted the idea of the people, the cultural idea of the people, that which we call Ubuntu. I am, because we are. So rather than just establishing one individual, they will get a group of people and create something for them so that they work together. They share the profit, but the capital, whatever they have, keeps going. It's like a revolving fund. They keep working with what they have. And this worked very well. As you can see, in the different countries where they have used, the daughters have worked, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, and other places. This has worked very well for the women. And the men also have bought into it, because now they know that the women are standing tall and becoming tall and very powerful. They had to, plus also, we too would want to be equipped. Phase 4 is advocacy for inclusion. As I said, the sisters worked very hard to include the people, but now the people had to begin to work for themselves. So The slogan was developed by persons with disabilities saying, nothing about us without us is for us. So if you are making policies, if you are doing anything, you want to do something for us, you must bring us to the table. We must be there as part of the discussion and also do what because we are the ones wearing the shoe. We know where it pinches. We must be part of the discussion. So that is the phase for where the daughters moved into. And this they didn't do alone. They had to collaborate with other agencies, civil society organizations, churches, Vincentian family, the government, and funding agencies. These are videos that I would have loved to play, but we don't have much time. Maybe when we finish, we can just leave it on during break. It's inclusion in liturgy, because when we're talking about Reformation, sometimes the church is very exclusive. If you are able, you count. If you are disabled, you don't count. Such that persons with hearing impairment will come to the church, they're just looking. And preaching is going on. Everything is going on. Nobody is minding them. Those with visual impairment, nothing is provided. At the point, the daughters had to have a walkout of one church in a particular country because there was no ramp for persons on wheelchair, nothing provided. Here, you take it for granted that when the news is going on, there is somebody interpreting. It's a foreign, in most parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. But the daughters pushed with the people until that now has become the order of the people. When you are reading the gospel, somebody will be there to interpret for the hearing impaired. And those with visual impairment can also read because provision is made. You will see all that I have been talking about, other people are also doing it. So what difference? What do the Daughters of Charity do differently? That brings me to the final phase, which is the missionary approach to development interventions. It has a conceptual framework. First, it is inspired by Christ and built on Christian inspiration and ethos, with the core principles of human dignity, social justice, option for the poor, solidarity, care for the environment, and the values of respect, justice, commitment, compassion, and integrity. The unique approach of missionaries, the long-term commitment. At breakfast today, one of the students was asking us, how long have you been the daughter? Some people said 60, some said 55, 54. Me, in my province, I am an old sister with 37 years vocation. But when I mix with other people, they will think you are still young. But that long-term commitment is what the Daughters of Charity bring to their mission. Even when others leave, they stay on. No matter the crisis, as long as there is the need to stay, the daughters remain. And they are rooted in the community where they serve. They are not just standing out there. They live with the people and they are among the people. There is a holistic approach. The whole person is considered. And they don't just pick an individual. If there is a child with disability, the parents must be involved. The local community must be involved. Sustainability is the issue, so that if the daughters tomorrow are not there, that work will continue and the people can survive without them. They move beyond sectoral support. It's not just about health or education, but the entire person with social support system. There is prophetic vision, risk-taking, action-oriented. They pioneer something, they start it, and they let it evolve. And they develop models of good practice, including accountability and transparency, such that wherever the Daughters of Charity ask for help, they get. Why? Because they will make you have value for your money if you give them donation. There is the aspect of personal witness based on their charism. They demonstrate values. They have a high level of personal commitment, and they are in solidarity with the poor. And when they care for the persons who live in poverty, they also care for the environment, because that is our common home. The daughters in their mission cross boundaries. They move in all directions, from north to south, east and west, and they move beyond cultural boundaries. They learn and influence one another across geographical, political, religious, and cultural contexts. Grace said yesterday that where it is about need, not about creed. So the Daughters of Charity don't just serve people because they are Christians. Once a human being is in need, that person is served, notwithstanding where or who or in what the person believes. They target the most vulnerable, they promote equality, they give spiritual and psychosocial support, they inspire and they empower. They have technical competence and they are all-inclusive in their approach. They connect with the stakeholders very much. The persons who are in need, the people around them, their relatives, the government, everybody who is involved is also carried along in their service. And all this lead to the enrichment and transformation of the lives of those who are poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. Like the proverbial starfish washed out by the tides, and which a little boy sought to save by throwing them one after the other back into the sea, the Daughters of Charity seek to pull back into mainstream society the marginalized persons whom they serve. They may not be able to save the whole of Africa's marginalized people, but to those whom they encounter, those whom they have encountered, those who they still encounter, they have always made a difference, and they will continue to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresa. That was wonderful. It's nice to know that the daughters too continue to evolve and change as the times do, and be more responsive to the needs of the people we're called to serve, as all of the members of the Vincentian family are. Our next speaker is going to be Father Dominique Iyolo, who is a Vincentian priest, and he is currently the Assistant General for the Vincentian community in Rome. He was born in the Dominican Republic of Congo, and Father was elected in 2022 at the General Assembly of the CMs to the General Council to be part of that international representation of 4 assistants. He was ordained in 1988, worked for more than 8 years as director of the major seminary, St. Vincent DePaul in Kimwaza, Democratic Republic of Congo. He's also taught at the University of St. Eugene de Mazanod in Kinshasa. And then from 2000 to 2009, he was the visitor or provincial for the CMs in DR Congo. Following this assignment, he was sent as a missionary to Belgium. There's a little reverse. Where he served for 6 years as both the superior of the Canonical House of Louvain and the Vincentians procurator of the Congo in Belgium. He holds a PhD from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and he is going to share with us his insights going forward. Father?
I would like to to thank the organizers of this meeting for asking me to present this modest reflection. I don't know why they choose me for this talk. I am speaking about the poor because my English is also poor. In his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis calls for a poor church for the poor. Evangelii Gaudium 1:9-8. To speak for a poor church for the poor seems ambiguous. And yet this notion of the Pope makes us appraise with relevance some problematic application of this modest reflection. Although they are intimately linked, allow me to begin by distinguishing and defining the words poor and poverty separately. Poor and poverty. Who is poor? It's a good question. We must be careful not to speak of the poor in an abstract way. Usually, to define a poor person, we refer to certain aspects of his or her life, such as lack of income, housing, education, inadequate health care, hunger, loneliness, etc. In our humble opinion, this is a reductionist understanding of the concept. Without questioning those different aspects that also define the poor, it seems appropriate to define it beforehand by situating the human being in his anthropological, theological dimension, an approach that may disturb our imagination and understanding. Every human being is essentially poor because one's life, everything he, she is, his, her qualities, abilities, talents, intelligence, etc., and everything he, she has is a free gift from the Creator to build love. Everyone has received freely from the Creator so that everyone too can give freely. Matthew 10:8. A poor person is one who has received everything and at the same time is in a position to give. Created free, each person is called to make the most of what one has as a gift in order to live in sharing and solidarity, especially with one's neighbor in need. We understand then why in Vincentian spirituality, a special place is given to the mysteries of the Incarnation and the Trinity. Through these two mysteries, God shares himself and empties himself in order to communicate all his richness to us. His poverty becomes our wealth. Born poor, the human being is enriched by God to build universal fraternity and to live in unconditional love in accordance with his her identity as a child of God. His her nature consists in living under the dependence of the Creator for whom he, she draws the love of life. The human person is an instrument of God in transforming humanity, and the work of creation is awareness of one's identity is indispensable in the service of the poor. Poverty, on the other hand, has many faces. It is multidimensional. it does not stem from a single cause. There is not one poverty, but many. Poverty can be structural because of conflict, natural disasters, diseases, epidemics, social and economic inequalities, corruption, exclusion, social disparity, selfishness, and violence due to the perverted heart of the human person. There is not only structural poverty. Poverty has other aspects, namely a life turned on itself without openness to the absolute. Famine, lack of housing, medical care, access to education, etc. These poverties invite conversion and must be defeated. Every Christian person conscious of its identity has the conviction that the preferential option for the poor is part of human condition. It is above all a categorical, a theological category. Because God made himself poor for the poor that we are, by virtue of the baptismal vocation, faithful to the universal destination of goods of that C 93, and to the common responsibility in this world, which is our common home. Evangelical Gaudium to Theresa. We Christians are called to become an instrument attentive to the cry of all those who live in any kind of poverty, in order to give them back what is theirs. Fratelli Tutti, 119. We are called to overcome the globalization of indifference by fighting for the dignity, promotion, and integral liberation of our neighbor in need. Through the vows, some Christians opt for a radical commitment to this unconditional gift to others, most especially for the poorest. This modest theological reflection also wanted to highlight the strong responsibility of the human person in the worrisome and dramatic situation that our world is experiencing today, the plain crisis, which generates many forms of poverty. Unable to get out of the comfort zone, today's human being is very often unaware of one's true identity, with a draw into itself. One seeks power for power's sake, with a heart that does not always give room to others. The Creator endowed human beings with intelligence, but instead of using it in respect of his initial plan, they seek to determine themselves and to become their own creators by making their own natures. Instead of recognizing themselves as humble managers and instruments of God in transforming of this world, they tend to see themselves as their own creators and set themselves up as the boss. Aiming for personal interest, they enter into the law of competition of who is the strongest. They want to accumulate indefinitely. They delight making other people poor. Thus, they contradict their nature of created in the image and the likeness of God. Sadly, social injustice due to a rich minority and a poor majority is no longer considered an evil but a good to be safeguarded at all costs. The human person is called to convert himself, herself, to her true identity. Saint Vincent de Paul worked hard to build a church totally dedicated to the cause of the poor. His great merit is to be an initiator and one of the great exponents of the theology and the spirituality of altruistic life, where special attention is given to the reduction of misery and the alleviation of human suffering. The Vincentian charism is essentially based on a concrete spirituality without a priorism. Vincent de Paul did not start by defining the poor. He discovered the poor and the different form of poverty of his time by remaining attentive to the circumstances, events, and the signs of the time. An expert in social sensitivity, Vincent de Paul read all events in the light of the Word of God. He discovered in Folleville, inspired by Luke, the spiritual poverty and the importance of teamwork. In Châtillon-les-Dombes, also inspired by Matthew, he discovered material poverty, the poor as a sacrament of Christ, the suffering servant, and so the importance of always turning the middle. Post 11.3.2. The need to organize a charity well through personal, concrete, and direct contact. The importance of training in the service of the poor. He founded a solid and permanent institution, namely the Congregation of the Mission, the Confraternity of Charity, and the Doctors of Charity for the Poor. He also made aware not only that the rich must put themselves at the service of the poor, and also that the poor must help each other, a spirituality of discovery. Saint Vincent is a true leader at the service of the poor and the vulnerable. Because he realized that the poor are the sacrament of Christ, Vincent de Paul totally overcome the globalization of indifference. He fought against exclusion and social disparity, courageously and dangerously facing the scourges that contributed to the impoverishment of his society. For years, France experienced the Fronde, one of the effects of which was famine. Vincent organized relief to help the refugees coming from the countryside. Isn't this the dramatic situation that many countries are experiencing today? Or are we challenged? When the plague had caused chaos and many deaths, Vincent, with all his foundation, involved themselves to fight against the poverty affected by this epidemic. The plague stricken rural poor were left to fend for themselves and starved to death. He invited his son and the doctors to come to the aid of the plague victims, but careful not to be infected, a prudent availability. There was a great loss of human lives in his family for this noble but graceful service. This fight against marginalization is also manifested in his work with abandoned children found at the door of churches, on street corners, and among the garbage in Paris. To fight against the exclusion of the poor and the social injustice. Vincent de Paul's realism is impressive. Concrete ocular visitation precedes helping. And the poor are called to become the main agent of their own integral development and dignity. They too must work with their hand to gradually get out of their situation. Their contribution is important in promoting their own dignity. Vincent does not make them perpetual dependents. It is a service that must not be rendered in a naive way. He acknowledges that the poor can be deceived, but not too much. Vincent de Paul's message is relevant today and invite the whole church to a permanent conversion by adopting a lifestyle that listens to the cries of the poor and never excludes them. A heart focused on its own interests remains self-serving and impoverished. It excludes the poor from the economic and social system and ruthlessly exploits them. It denies the primacy of the human being. The church is called to overcome individualistic, indifferent, and selfish mentality in order to remain attentive to all forms of poverty and fragility. This is her vocation. She must become an instrument that socially integrates the poor. She has much to learn from St. Vincent, who was not happy with the status quo. His great creativity made him mobilize not only priests and consecrated persons, but also lay people in the service of the poor and the vulnerable with a good formation. He did everything to ensure that there was also an especially active involvement of women in the fight against poverty and unjust structures. We simply have to read attentively his letter, his conferences, his spiritual discussion, the rulers he had drawn up toward an effective service of the poor in order to realize the spirit he always wanted to inculcate in all those who were involved in this service. In our days, many calamities cause great poverty to which we are indifferent and slow to react. One good and clear example is the senseless and unjust war in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why such an interminable and bloody war? The answer is easy to give. That is because of the rich natural resources of this part of my country. This shameful war manifests the perverted heart of human. This war causes bloodbath to flow every day and further reach poverty to the total indifference of international attention. When international opinions keep silence in the face of such a dramatic situation, we wonder whether they are doing this out of complicity or complacency. The longer this war lasts, the more certain countries that are powerful continue and will continue to fraudulently exploit the country's minerals, enriching themselves and at the expense of the local population. This war wanted and encouraged by certain greedy powers has strongly contributed to the impoverishment of the local population. What contrast! Born with rich natural resources, the local population cannot only enjoy its wealth, but also forced to suffer for inhuman exploitation because of this senseless, unjust, and imposed war. She is rolling in real poverty and dying of hunger. She left her village to live elsewhere. This war created migrants and refugees and many more poor people. Many voices are raised to even speak of the desire of Balkanization of the country. The local bishops speak about it and denounce the situation, but all in vain. The culpable silence of the international community has not astonished the entire population of the country and send a message that the international community is an accomplice. There is a war in Ukraine. Everyone is talking about this, and information is given to us every day. However, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we do not talk about this tragedy and what the local population in the east of this country are going through. They are a forgotten people without any human dignity, whose cries are no longer heard because those who claim to be the strongest want to monopolize the wealth of the region to enrich themselves and their own country. Is it acceptable today that we can exploit the weak by shedding their blood and driving them out of their place of origin? To exploit the weak, do the powerful have the right to kill them and give them the impression that they are like animals that can be slaughtered and at any time? We have to work harder in order to change this mentality. This is one poverty that has its origin in the perverted heart of humans. Inflicting unjust suffering on others is simply human insensitivity. The vocation of the church is to become the voice of the voiceless and to have the courage, audacity, and creativity of Vincent de Paul. The church denounces injustice, but must do so even more creatively. Voices are being raised everywhere to create awareness and to invite good management of our environment. Do we associate and identify ourselves with these voices that care about the present and the future of our common reader? Armed with this influence, Vincent de Paul was not afraid to associate with the political authorities who cared less for the precariousness of the lives of others. Let us arm ourselves with his courage. Today, the church must dare to be great, to be courageous, and daring to take concrete initiatives, to have creativity in the service of the poor, like Vincent de Paul, spirituality of open eyes, saying that love is inventive unto infinity. Allow me to conclude by quoting Vincent de Paul. Let us love God, my brothers and sisters. Let us love God, but let it be by the strength of our arm. Let it be by the sweat of our brows. For so often, so many acts of love of God, thou very good and very desirable, are nevertheless suspect when they do not come to the practice of effective love. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Father, very much. Well, we've heard about the poor as theologians. We've heard about the evolution of ministries where we take the poor from doing for them to helping them to assume responsibility for their own future. And we also heard about the effect that war and greed and power have on those who live on the margins. So now I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk among yourselves and to look at what you've heard and see how it impacts what your ministries are currently, and then we'll come back for some questions, okay? Do you have questions for our panelists? What resonated with you? What challenged you? And what would you like clarified by any one of our panelists?
Yes. One of the basically is to get the lay involved in.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentations. One of the things that we talked about here was that while you talked about poverty and marginalization around the world, no different in downtown Chicago or St. Louis or wherever we're from, the same dynamics are there. I had a question for you, sister. In terms of the work of the daughters in Sub-Saharan Africa, it looked from your slides and from your talk that there must have been some kind of an initial investment of land or money or food. Can you talk a little bit about how that got started? Because the poor right there didn't have those resources. They had to be brought in. How did that happen, and what kind of amounts were you dealing with?
Okay. When you talk about initial investments, it would be, let's say, the daughters acquiring land, right? Actually, the daughters of charity who came to Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, were very favored. In as much as the people, like the area I come from, Nigeria, the sisters had the privilege of getting land for free. Yes, like I said, the people saw them when they came like the savior. You know, they came to help us. They didn't come to take from us. It was different. They saw them differently from the colonizers. They were there with the people. They were helping them, and it was evident. So when they said they wanted to build a school for the children to have a place, the chiefs would say, take. Yes, and the sisters were very good. Like what had sustained the indigenous sisters, because most of the missionaries, most of them have gone back because of age or illness. And maybe when they have seen the people grow, they go. They were able to secure the land. The places that they didn't, the government took them back. But if the sisters, they were, let me just give them their due. They were smart enough to register the land in the name of the Daughters of Charity, the company of the Daughters of Charity. So it was secured. And from there, but sometimes as governments came, they saw that the lands were too big. And they would say, you can't have all this. So they will cut some and take for themselves, the government now, and say, this is your convent, this is your ministry. This vastness doesn't concern you. In most places, it happens like that. But as for landed property, the sisters got a lot of free gifts from the chiefs. Where it was necessary, they bought. And because there were funding from the overseas at that time, to the sisters who are on ground trying to invest, if there was need, they also buy land and create whatever they want to create, because the overseas donation has reduced, as all of us are aware. Yes. I don't know if that answered your question. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to follow up to Sister, because this idea of taking people's ancestral land. So the idea of taking people's ancestral land is odious and has to be rejected. And yes. I think Pope Francis is conscious of that this day, that we shouldn't be taking land, because those kings who were given those land, how much consultation did they make? Are they kind of taking people's land? Is causing trouble today in many parts of Africa, because some of the folks who are coming up are saying, how could you give my inheritance away? So land is not to be given. People are tied to the land by is an ancestral bond, a covenant. And so I really think that it's something that has to be revisited in the church in Africa, to just as we're talking about the indigenous peoples here in Canada, in the US and in Canada. Sorry, I lived in Canada for 8 years. I was in Canada. So, but this is the same thing in Latin America. Same thing we're talking about in the Amazon, taking people's land. In Congo, your father can talk more even about that. It's a big problem today.
Theresa?
Yes, thank you, Sister. Father Stan, you're very correct. Actually, in Nigeria, when I was there, we had some problem. The first place that the daughters landed in Nigeria, the chiefs had given land, to the sisters for schools and then a clinic. Eventually, the generations after, in the year 2017, they came looking for their land. For the daughters, again, I want to say that the daughters were conscious of the justice aspect. The daughters were not involved. The church was, because the land, I think they did like this. But for the daughters, the place that the daughters lived, that were given, the individual families, the owners of the land themselves, had to write and give this land. The question was in perpetuity. That was what the grandparents did. That didn't happen for the church at large, but for the daughters, this place that they gave to them was given totally directly to the Daughters of Charity, and they paid something. It may not be, if you compare it to it may not be a huge amount, but the sisters, and they gave every family that gave the sisters land, scholarship was given to that family, whoever they raised. Maybe if they say 2-2, you bring 2 people from your family in exchange for this thing you have done. And that Daughters of Charity actually covered it, because that case came up and it went to the court. So the daughters were exonerated from the fight between the church and the indigenes and the government. But what you're saying is correct, because actually it is, so far in my own experience with the Daughters of Charity, the places I have been to, if it was something that was given and the grandchildren come up and say they want their land, you take your land. It's not very much, and it's because we are conscious of the justice part of it. Thank you.
I think there's probably 2 things going on here. One, I think you're talking the period of colonialism, where the church simply came in and took land, as opposed to people inviting the sisters and offering them land in order to do a ministry that was going to benefit the people. But as Theresa said, if they change their mind by the next generation or the third generation down, then fine, we'll give you back your land. We're not gonna fight about it. Yes.
Sister Eki, a question. In Africa, what, if anything, are you doing to prepare the laity to address the need to see poverty as a systemic problem? You talked about the daughters. I'm curious about the laity.
The laity, yes. You know, through education, as I said, both the daughters and the society are evolving. You know, we didn't have it all together initially, but as development came, as we got experiences from other places, the daughters also have keyed into the education of people. And how do you say, adopting the approach, the systemic approach to development. It's not just us, even in the education system, where the curriculum is developed in such a way that this is put into consideration, so that the people also will become the promoters, the agents of their own promotion, rather than just having theoretical knowledge. That skills development, capacity development is built into the curriculum, so that at the end of the day, what you are talking about is also changing the system, even ideologically, changing the system that is oppressing us. Okay, we are here today, and people are saying there is no job, there is nothing, we finish education, we don't have any work. How can we change that? Not just by becoming independent, but also by challenging the system that is oppressing us, by challenging the things we need to challenge. So all those are built into the curriculum of the education that daughters are embracing now. The sisters are being trained, the lay people are being trained alongside them as well. Because at the end of the day, we are depending on the lay people to get to where we cannot get as far as the government is concerned.
So is this being done through partnerships? How are the laity and, let's say, the daughters, how are the laity getting that training and what have you through the daughters? Are they doing it in partnerships? Are they doing it separately, or?
We are doing it in partnership, and most of the time, actually, it's the laity now that are initiating it.
Ah,
yes.
okay.
We have a group of women who they're not essentially ladies of charity. They are not essentially ladies of charity, but there are some ladies of charity among them who have these links with other agencies that they have created a kind of program. They are trying to push it. They are trying to push it into the educational system. It hasn't worked yet. I know we have in Ethiopia with the situation now that is not help, but some missionaries have helped to bring something there so that they can push it into the education system. They haven't got to where they want to get, but that is coming. It's not daughters that initiated it. It's in partnership with other groups.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is a question for all three of the panelists, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the positive aspect of poverty. Dorothy Day used to say, I fight against poverty, but I advocate for poverty. And Jorge, you mentioned Ignacio Echeverria, and he had this idea that the goal is a civilization of poverty. So we talk about poverty as something that we have to lift people out of, and he was afraid that just kind of leaves the system the way it is, and it makes it sound like we've got we're good and you need to be more like us. You poor people need to be more like us. And he said, no, what we need is for everybody to share the civilization of poverty. And that's a very different kind of way of thinking about poverty. He wanted us all to be poor in that sense. So I wonder if you could comment on what that might mean, what that might look like. I mean, you all took vows of poverty, right?
Some did. Think about it.
So it must be someone thing at some.
May you translate me?
You mean simple lifestyle?
May you translate me?
Sure, yeah, Ignacio Correa.
No, see, I understand.
Oh, wait for you, okay,
I
yeah,
understand.
okay,
Yes, I
sure.
understand. Creo que hay muchas maneras de hablar de esto, de cómo los pobres,
There are many ways of talking about poverty,
cómo los pobres pueden ser una buena noticia.
how the poor can be good news,
Hay muchas maneras.
in many ways.
Y una manera puede ser que los pobres son los protagonistas de la alegría,
One way is that the poor can be the protagonists of joy,
en el sentido cristiano del término,
in the Christian sense of this term.
porque por otra parte es evidente que los pobres pueden ser los protagonistas de la tristeza.
But on the other hand, it could also be that the poor are protagonists of sadness.
Las bienaventuranzas de Jesús están dirigidas a los pobres principalmente. Felices ustedes.
The Beatitudes are directed at the poor. Happy are those.
Yes. Y por esta razón, si las bienaventuranzas están destinadas a los pobres, los demás sabremos en qué consiste la alegría del Evangelio a través de los pobres.
So if the Beatitudes are directed towards the poor, then the rest of us can understand
The joy of the gospel.
Si los pobres son los destinatarios del Evangelio, los preferenciales, el resto, no solamente los cristianos, el resto de la humanidad puede saber en qué consiste la alegría del Evangelio a través de los pobres.
So if the Beatitudes are directed toward the poor, then the rest of us, not only Christians, but everybody can understand what joy means through the means of the poor.
We have an online question.
Do either,
Excuse me. Theresa or Dominique?
Dominique, do you want to respond?
Yes, and my sister will help me to translate in English. I want to speak in French, is in French. Bon, l'aspect positif de la pauvreté, je crois que si on voit bien Saint Vincent de Paul, notre loi, nous qui sommes là pour nous mettre au service des pauvres, notre loi, la loi qui régit un peu notre vocation est vraiment extérieure à nous. Et si cette loi extérieure, je veux dire que les pauvres nous apprennent beaucoup.
So if I'm going to speak about the positive aspects of poverty, and if we look at the teaching of St. Vincent de Paul, and when we look at what he tells us, really we have a lot to learn from the poor themselves.
Oui, Saint Vincent lui-même, quand il imaginait des choses, il n'avait pas quelque chose de prédéterminé, mais il venait, il observait, et là on voit que petit à petit il essayait de faire une lecture de cela, de cette pauvreté à la lumière de la parole, et il allait très loin.
So when we look at what St. Vincent did, when he started to work with the poor, he didn't have specific ideas in mind. He just entered in the experience, he observed, and connecting that experience, the events, what he was seeing and the word of God, then he started to understand what needed to be done.
Et à la fin, quand on pose à Vincent de Paul la question, tu as fait ça comment? Il dit, je ne sais pas. Je ne sais pas comment ça fait. Ça montre que les pauvres l'ont aidé à aller plus loin.
So whenever people would ask Vincent de Paul, how did you manage to do all that? He said, I have no idea. And that's a way of telling us really that he just followed the way that the poor themselves were showing.
We have just an online question here that is partly about interreligious engagement. When working in solidarity with others, how do you work interreligiously? So, and specifically, for example, during the time of Ramadan that we're in now, do you work with those of the Muslim faith tradition or with others? So I think that's the gist of the question. Working beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, the Daughters of Charity, I would say, depending on where we are, we have sisters serving in Muslim areas. So at times like this, actually it's a community celebration and they participate. But generally in our works, we have staff who are Muslims, we have staff who are Christians, those who are of no faith in different places in Africa. So all those are respected. The principles that are laid down are for the promotion of the human person, of the environment. And whatever divides us is not very much emphasized. What unites us are the things that we emphasize the most. And when it comes to religion, everybody's own faith or creed is respected. And depending on the times, like the Muslims will decide to take their break at this time, the Christians at Easter or whatever, and all those are respected. And we celebrate everybody because we are majorly, in Africa, you have this multiplicity of religions, and faith. So I don't know if...
Dominic, did you want to say something?
Yes, I can try. Très souvent, nous pouvons croire que le service des pauvres, c'est notre apanage.
We are often tempted to believe that the service of the poor is our specificity.
Je crois que ce n'est pas vrai. Comme je l'ai dit dans ma conférence, notre condition humaine nous pousse à rendre ce service.
But I don't think that's true. I think, as I mentioned in my intervention, that from our human condition, we are called to serve, especially the marginalized.
Je crois qu'on soit musulman, qu'on soit chrétien, catholique, dans notre raison, on a cette capacité de nous mettre au service des autres. Dieu n'a pas donné la richesse seulement aux chrétiens catholiques, mais à toute l'humanité. Donc on est là pour servir nous tous, qu'on soit catholique, musulman, on est là pour donner, faire de notre vie un don pour rendre les autres heureux.
So whatever religion we practice, Muslim, Christian, Catholic, we are meant to be at the service of others and to make of our life a gift for others.
En tout cas, dans mon pays, il n'y a aucun problème à travailler avec les autres qui ne sont pas catholiques. On le fait et ça marche très bien.
And from my experience in my country, we have no difficulty working with people from different faith or non-believers. We do it and it works perfectly.
Okay. Any other? Yes, Mike.
I was wondering about the conversation about systemic poverty and marginalization as it's been discussed this morning. And I'm struck by the fact that the systemic notions that we're engaging are left unspecified. I wasn't prepared to have an extensive conversation on poverty and exclusion that never mentions the word capitalism. And I think that whether that's as a matter of prudence or whether that's a matter of indifference, I think it changes the path forward in thinking about some of these things, because without engaging that as a system shaping other systems, we all too often can find ourselves locked in an understanding of the power dynamics that Father Dominique mentioned that are insufficiently robust. It might be without that kind of specification that we talk about improving the circumstance of excluded and marginalized people to become the next generation of excluders and marginalizers themselves. Or it might mean having a slightly better circumstance in a system in which poverty and immiseration is not an unfortunate byproduct, but an intentional construct. We have a former Treasury Secretary in the United States whose idea about economic development and uplift included using sub-Saharan African countries as a repository for toxic waste. Because based upon the dominant understanding of economics, that would be rational and beneficial both to people in the North and to people in sub-Saharan Africa who would gain exchange value at the level of national economies. So I wonder how the conversation shifts and the path forward looks differently if capitalism is brought back into the conversation and rather than being left as that which dare not speak its name.
Okay, anybody want to address it? Simple. I'm sure you can knock it off in 2 or 3 sentences.
Oh, let her do it.
It's not my area of specialization, so I would not even dare.
Thank you.
I think when we talk about the human condition, unfortunately, greed is a big piece of it. And greed leads to the whole thing of capitalism. And everybody wants to feel they're better than somebody else, whether it's to their detriment or not. And so I think it's something we do have to keep in mind. Absolutely. We might not like to talk about capitalism. It's somewhat of an unpopular concept right now. However, it is an underlying foundation for many things. Betty Ann?
I would just like to comment on what Michael said, because the last speaker spoke of the globalization of indifference. And it seems to me that relates very directly to the issue of capitalism and the internal compassion or concern. But a question would be, could you speak more on the spirituality of discovery? I have not heard that terminology before. Dominique?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je fais juste une réflexion en lisant un peu les écrits de Vincent de Paul. Et en entrant un peu en profondeur, j'ai essayé d'approfondir et j'ai vu que Vincent de Paul, tout ce qu'il a fait, c'est qu'il allait de découverte en découverte.
So going through the writings of Vincent de Paul and the work that we realized, as I deepen in this understanding, what I understand is that Vincent de Paul evolved from discovery to discovery, from experience to experience.
Parce que quand on voit, au début, on voit qu'il n'a pas une idée de ce qu'il va faire, il est jeté là-dedans, il découvre, et en découvrant, il avance, il évolue, il avance. Au début, c'est très modeste, mais après, ça devient un arbre.
So Vincent de Paul really, when he starts his work, we know the founding events, but when he starts his work, he has no idea where he's going. So he starts very modestly, he starts doing things, and then as he does, he evolves, things change, and this becomes a huge tree. He had no idea of what was going to happen.
I wrote that down too, the spirituality of discovery. And what you mentioned was that notion of the poor helping the poor. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
J'avais parlé de la spiritualité découverte en lien avec la notion de pauvres. De serving the poor, you said?
Or helping the poor. Helping the poor.
L'autre pauvre et dans les pauvres. Dans ce contexte-là que tu avais parlé.
Mais la spiritualité de la découverte, le lien entre la spiritualité de la découverte et le service des pauvres. Bon, moi, je partais de Saint Vincent de Paul. C'est un peu notre spiritualité. Je pars de Saint Vincent de Paul. Et en partant de Saint Vincent de Paul, je trouve que même nous aujourd'hui, si nous voulons vraiment nous mettre au service des pauvres, on ne peut pas partir avec des idées prédéterminées.
So I'm really focusing on this Vincentian spirituality, Vincentian experience, because that's what we're living. And really, if you look at what St. Vincent did to help the poor, you cannot do it without being next to the poor, without being engaged with them.
Je crois que Saint Vincent de Paul a fait le contraire de ce que nous faisons aujourd'hui.
And I think Vincent de Paul did the contrary of what we do today.
Nous, quand on veut servir les pauvres, on arrive, on dit, bon, on va donner la nourriture, on va faire ceci, on va faire cela. Tout est déjà fixé.
So when we aim at serving the poor, we tend to already have an idea and decide what we're going to do, feed them, assist them in a specific way, and we already know what we want to do.
Mais quand je vois Saint Vincent de Paul, il envoie même des frères là pour aller regarder, il y a combien de pauvres, on doit compter, ils ont des habits, ils n'ont pas. Il suit, il regarde, mais ce n'est qu'après qu'il essaie de comprendre. Mais une fois qu'il a compris, alors on voit qu'il se met, il s'engage, et quand il s'engage, on voit que c'est très efficace.
Well, Vincent de Paul has a different approach. In certain occasions, he would have some Vincentian brothers go to the place of the poor, requiring that they count the poor, that they see what the needs are. Is this clothing? Is this feeding? What is the need? And then when they come back with this information, that's when he starts acting, and then his action is very efficient.
Et je vois que Saint Vincent de Paul, on voit qu'il cherche, il fait tout pour qu'il ait lui-même un contact direct, un contact concret, un contact personnel. Et une fois qu'il a ça, il commence à lire cela, et alors le service devient plus efficace.
So Vincent de Paul focused a lot on a direct contact with the poor, the connection with the poor. And only from that connection, from observing and from learning there, does he start imagining what charity should look like.
Thank you. Thank you. Theresa, we have to wrap it up.
It's not a question. It's just as I was reflecting on what the question on capitalism, is it mine? I was just wondering, like there was a statement you made that stayed with me. Like now we are emphasizing on this systemic change. At the end of the day, that we are hoping that this generation we are trying to bring up to save from perhaps poverty and elevate will not end up being capitalists themselves and maybe oppressing the generations after them. In other words, they have been oppressed. So in the future that we are hoping they will not become oppressors themselves. With that, yes, I think it's really stayed with me and I'm still chewing it. But I think when we are it's waking me up to something. And I think we should also guard against theoretical approach or maybe a streamlining issues. Father was talking about premeditated approach, maybe having something in mind and planning it and dishing it out. But to assume a holistic approach to add morality to what we are actually passing on. So that it's just like when we're talking about feminism. Okay, there was a time we think that the men are all on top of us. So now we women should rise. And when you rise, sit on top of the men. It's not what we are saying. We are talking about creating an equal playing ground for everybody so that what I do not like for myself, I should not wish it to another person. And it goes back to the gospel. If the place I'm sitting today as a marginalized person, I didn't like it. When Bill was talking about the positive, aspect of poverty, sometimes the much positive you could say is that the poor, they accept their lot. Sometimes it is like internalizing oppression, which is not really positive if you ask me. But the truth is, if I don't like where I'm sitting today, if I am helped through reasoning, through education, and whatever else, to move out of it, that I look back, rather than sit over people, to try to pull others along with me to a safe place where there is no victor and no vanquished. That will be my approach to it. Thank you.
Jasmine, this is the last word.
Yes, the last word. Thank you for letting it in. I think when we're talking about the question Mike did, I think from a Vincentian perspective, there's also a piece that we're not putting in enough, and that's essential in the Vincentian charism, and that piece is community. We're looking at it from the individual, us, the poor, them. We're looking at it from a shifting of space, of place at some times, and that's what Mike questions go in that direction, right? We might be maintaining or encouraging capitalism, which have already showed that it's failing. And when we introduce the element of community, then we think about this dynamic of inclusion and of transformation from a different perspective. And I think that's an element that we need to bring to the conversations and think differently about what kind of society we are in now and what kind of society we can build in the future.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and all of you. For those who are interested, there will be mass in the chapel over in the Student Center now. And,